Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be Part 51, Chapter 51, entitled Skeletons in the Closet. If there was anything Aizawa knew for certain after Midoriya's cryptic phone call, it was that he'd never been stuck in traffic for longer in his life. He'd been on autopilot since. The first thing he did was call Tsukauchi, who'd promised to meet him there with the rest of the police force, and then promptly hung up. Aizawa decidedly did not like filling the silence with his racing thoughts, so he called Yamada next. He was still teaching, all of UA still was, since only Aizawa had allowed his students to leave early. But it didn't take long for the voice hero to leave him too, rushing to inform Nezu and the rest of the staff. Aizawa understood the rationale, but for once he wished one of them would have kept him on the phone instead, however impractical it might have been. A past him probably would have thought he was going senile, but Midoriya had changed him, for the better and the worse, as he sat alone in his car, desperately trying not to let the worst of possibilities drown him preemptively. He didn't even bother finding a spot to park, pulling up on the curb as police swarmed the Kyoshi Ward shopping mall, hastily escorting civilians out. Some moved to approach him, likely unprepared to see a random car almost drive through the mall entrance, but one flash of his hero license sent them away, and off to find Tsukauchi. Aizawa couldn't find it in himself to feel upset. At least they were here. Tsukauchi was here. So Midoriya was safe. That was his mantra the whole way inside. With police clearing the mall, it was very easy to see the group of children huddled towards the center, with a few straggling officers around them. Aizawa recognized some of his students among the mass, but Midoriya's messy green hair was nowhere in sight. His heart picked up the pace as his feet did. The noise of his steps drew some attention back to him. "Aizawa-sensei!" He was soon swarmed by a smaller crowd of stress-etched faces, of reddened eyes and worried wrinkles. He looked his students over carefully, checking them over for injuries and other ailments. When he could find none, his focus shifted. "Where's Midoriya?" Ida, who'd been one of the ones to rush over to him, gestured behind wordlessly. Aizawa peered over, through the new opening in the crowd. His eyes landed on Midoriya, sitting lifelessly by the edge of some foliage, a hand guarded around his throat, with Uraraka kneeling next to him, her hand wrapped around his other. His eyes landed on Midoriya. Aizawa could almost hear the sigh of relief wheeze through his teeth. He stepped forward, approaching Midoriya. He recognized that look in his eye. Aizawa didn't usually deal with the civilian aftermath under his cover of darkness. He heard about them more often from Yamada's day-to-day work. The doe-eyed, skittish face, the manic desperation, the shattered hope they held together as they ran. Yamada admitted to him once that was one of the big reasons he'd stuck with his bright, blasé attitude for so long. It helped quickly de-escalate the finality of the situation and convince civilians that the danger was long gone. Midoriya's look was not the same. The boy's eyes held quiet defeat, a silent resignation. Aizawa had noted the shadows that had been slowly creeping forth through his gaze since the beginning of the term, building with every tear he leaked, with every bit he bled. He held on to his worries that they would one day smother him, but he was awkwardly met with the realization that Midoriya instead had shrunk back and allowed himself to hide in them. There was no hopelessness, but instead a submissive understanding. It had been a while since he'd seen it, but Aizawa knew that look all too well. He joined Uraraka in a squat, placing a hand on Midoriya's knee. Surprisingly, the boy let him. "Midoriya." The hero kept his voice low, but looked him in the eye. "Can you hear me?" He watched his lips part for a moment, but instead of sound, Aizawa was met with a small nod. Uraraka took the opportunity to stand, looking down at Aizawa. "When I got to him, Shigaraki had him by the—" She trailed off, but he understood anyway. "He managed to get some words out earlier, but it wasn't much. I'm worried that he's hurt, but he won't let anyone see his neck." "Thank you, Uraraka. You did all the right things," Aizawa reassured the shaky look on her face. "Could you give us a moment?" She looked hesitant, but nodded her head slowly, sending Midoriya one last longing glance before retreating back to the safety of the rest of her classmates. Aizawa watched her leave before turning back to Midoriya, his eye settling on his neck now. Only then did he notice how precariously Midoriya's hand was wrapped around it. He refused to touch his own skin with his fingers, but still held his hand close to shield the area from view. It was odd, but it reassured Aizawa more than anything. If there was blood, Midoriya would have had enough presence of mind to put pressure on it. "It's just us now," Aizawa hummed, glancing back just to make sure no one was peeking over. They weren't. Midoriya's peers held enough respect for his dignity. "I need to take a look, just to make sure you aren't hurt." He gently placed a hand on Midoriya's arm, with no real force behind it. "Can I?" There was a strong hesitation. Aizawa would have been surprised if there wasn't. For a moment, Midoriya's eyes refocused, returning from the empty void he'd been staring out into. He forced himself out of hiding, tentatively ready to confront what had so ruthlessly destroyed him. Aizawa could only see the water budding at the corners of his eyes for a moment, before Midoriya retreated back just as suddenly. He suppressed his sigh. It was worth a shot. He shouldn't have expected him to. Midoriya, despite his 1,000-yard stare off into the distance, lowered his defensive hand slowly, settling it softly on his lap. Aizawa could finally see it. An ugly, dark bruise stained his throat, still red from irritation despite having time for reprieve, the edges a fuzzy yellow hue from where his breath had been cut off. Aizawa could make out the clear outline, easily able to count where each finger had been. It was instinctually sickening, despite how much worse he'd seen throughout the years, and yet he couldn't help but feel a sliver of relief. Midoriya already had one permanent handprint etched onto his skin. At least it wasn't two. It was then that he understood. He stood up slowly, giving Midoriya time to cover up his neck again. Aizawa made an obvious move to pat at his back, careful not to touch anywhere near his nape. "It's a little hectic in here still. Why don't we head outside and take a moment? If Tsukauchi needs us, he'll come find us." Midoriya swallowed thickly, cringing at how the movement pulled at his skin around his throat. His eyes nervously flickered from Aizawa to his distracted classmates, and even without words, Aizawa got the message. "They'll be all right. Tsukauchi and the rest of the police force are here, and they probably need to get their statements anyway." He knew Tsukauchi's department was efficient, but even they weren't that fast. "No one will miss us for a minute." Midoriya nodded in agreement, but instead of turning towards the exit, he glanced briefly to the side by the foliage, away from anything of visible interest. Aizawa furrowed his brows, but despite his analytical eyes, he wasn't sure what, if anything, Midoriya was referring to. Still, when the boy gestured his head, a clear indication to follow, Aizawa did not hesitate. They walked a few steps away from where Midoriya had been seated, stopping seemingly around nothing. Midoriya looked around quickly, and Aizawa stepped closer to shield them from prying eyes just a bit more. Then, Midoriya reached out with his free hand and seemingly grasped for air, to even the watchful eye. But Aizawa had an inkling for what to look for. He didn't miss the way his hand sagged with an unnatural weight. Aizawa watched Midoriya's hand shift a little, tugging at what was in his grip. The hero focused hard, but he could not see any other reaction, despite however minuscule it might have been. Based on the flash of displeasure across Midoriya's face, he didn't think Midoriya saw anything either. "Something's wrong with Gami." Aizawa frowned, utterly torn between the immediate relief at finally hearing Midoriya's voice and the devastating whiplash as a mangled whisper met his ears instead. And for one of the many times throughout his career, he found himself swallowing down his humanity in favor of the indifference that his instincts provided. "More reason to get you both out of here, then. Come on." Finally, Midoriya turned his focus to the exit, and Aizawa couldn't help but feel impressed by how easily Midoriya feigned natural movement with his arm. He knew what to look for, and even still, the underground hero had trouble catching the extra force Midoriya had used to pull Gami's arm with his own. But the pride had shifted quickly to discomfort. Midoriya and Gami had really only had each other for a very long time, and now he didn't think it was possible for him to even imagine how lonely the boy felt. God, the universe really had it out for this kid. They'd almost made it outside without incident, but as fate would have it, almost would never equal certainty. "Aizawa!" Tsukauchi called out to him, approaching from another brief congregation with some other officers. He rolled his eyes, but nevertheless stopped his pace. "Now you show up." "My men told me when you arrived, but we had one last sweep to finish," the detective explained, dropping his voice down low now that they were closer. "We're updating the radius, but I doubt it'll change much." Aizawa wasn't an idiot. Neither was Midoriya. Tsukauchi didn't have to spell it out for them to get what he meant. Tsukauchi glanced down at Midoriya, huddled close to Aizawa's side. He tried to keep his eyes off the bruising that bled out behind his hand, and instead focused on how he kept the other in a death grip. Somehow that didn't make him feel any better. "I'm really sorry to have to do this," Tsukauchi started hesitantly. "I'm sure you both just want to go home at this point." "You haven't talked to him yet?" Aizawa questioned aggressively. The detective held up his hands in surrender. "We had to clear them all before we got here. Civilian safety comes before any other procedures, you know that." He gestured over his shoulder to where the police were now speaking with some of Midoriya's classmates. "We're just taking statements now." Strangely, Aizawa felt consumed by the irrational instinct to keep fighting Tsukauchi. He understood what the other was talking about perfectly well. Underground heroes dealt the most with messy police procedures, more than anyone else. There was nothing wrong with the detective's logic, but there was still this overwhelming side of him upset with the whole thing. Didn't Tsukauchi understand that they'd been through enough as it was? Didn't Tsukauchi understand that he needed to get Midoriya home already, where he and Yamada could reassure him that everything was all right, and nothing like this would ever happen again? He felt a small jab at his side, looking down to see where Midoriya had nudged him with his elbow. "Don't be mad, please." The gravelly mumble immediately broke his heart, reminding Aizawa just how soft he'd become. "Sorry, Tsuka. It's been a day," Aizawa admitted, as if the other had no idea what he was talking about. "Though, could you give us a minute? I promised Midoriya we'd go outside for some peace and quiet." Tsukauchi looked at them sadly, clearly not immune to broken hearts or softness either. "You don't have to apologize, I get it. You didn't let me finish before, but let me do you one better." He pulled his car keys out of his pocket, handing them to Aizawa. "My car's got tinted windows, plus you can't hear anything from the outside. I was thinking, since your interview will probably take the longest anyway, we could just do it at the station. None of this mess over there to worry about." Aizawa hummed. "Would you rather that, Midoriya?" That's fine." Aizawa listened, but heard nothing more than maimed breaths behind his words. He was morbidly reassured. "Sounds good then, Tsuka." He placed a gentle hand on Midoriya's back. "Could you have the station prepare some ice, too?" "Yeah, I'll let them know we'll need some minor first aid." Aizawa gave him a long look. "Thank you." Anything Tsukauchi observed during their conversation he didn't comment on. "Sure thing." The three moved to part ways, Tsukauchi heading back to help the rest of the police force finish up. Aizawa fumbled with the keys, hooking a finger in one of the metal loops, dropping his hand from Midoriya, who remained close to him anyway. "Midori!" They turned around again, finding Uraraka almost barreling towards them. She skidded to a stop in front of them, taking a moment to catch her breath and rub at her face. She moved her hand away, revealing newly reddened eyes and puffy cheeks. Still, she looked at him with a bright, bubbly smile, she must have forced up from the very pits of her heart. "You're going to be okay." She said it for both of them. "You will." Midoriya nodded slowly, somehow finding the willpower to send her a small smile back. "I will." He said it for her, sincere and true. She nodded, over and over again, refusing to let them out of her sight as they walked back out of the mall until the policeman eventually led her back to the group. Midoriya winced at the sun, forgetting it was still barely mid-afternoon. It had seemed like he'd been stuck inside there for an eternity. And despite being faced with the truth that it had likely barely been an hour, it would always be an eternity to him. He followed Aizawa blindly, dragging Gami behind him. He tried not to think about the lifeless weight he was pulling along with him. He tried not to think about the cold, skeletal bite in his hand. He tried not to think about the copious amounts of mist and fog that leaked into his peripherals. He tried not to think about all the worst possible things that could be happening. He tried not to think about how if he maybe had pushed his mentor just a little more to share some of the things locked away in his mind, that maybe this wouldn't be happening right now. That maybe Gami would be fine and he would understand what was even going on and he wouldn't have to be alone and afraid. Here. Aizawa stopped in front of an unassuming car, pressing a button on the key fob before opening the backseat door. "I'm going to wait for Tsukauchi out here. Why don't you and Gami take a moment? I'll be right outside if you need me." Midoriya didn't think he could gather the words even if he wanted to, so he nodded instead, practically shoving Gami's motionless body into the back seat before climbing in himself. He heard the door close gently behind him, and now, surrounded by shadows and silence, Midoriya came out of hiding. He dropped his hand from his neck, letting his skin scrunch up as fat, ugly tears erupted from his eyes. He tried to put his thoughts into words, but there was nothing equivalent to the boundless distress and despair he'd kept pent up for an hour, for his eternity. What came from his mouth was nothing but guttural sobs and hitched screams, but his disarray cared not for what sounds he was making, just as long as they were gone. "Gami, please, please, I'm scared." For once, he didn't care how pathetic he sounded as he begged. For once, he convinced himself that he was a child first, and everything else second. "Please come back." He grabbed the ghost harshly, shaking him desperately, hoping to jolt him back to normal. But his fingers merely sunk into his viscous robe, and Gami remained just as lifeless as before. "Why?" He shed the strong facade, ripping it away from him in disgust as he settled into his hands. What did I do?" But nothing, no one, bothered to answer him. If there was any visible evidence of Midoriya's cry fest once Aizawa and Tsukauchi entered the car, they didn't make a comment. When the car began to move, Midoriya's hand shot out towards Gami's, clutching it tight. The ghost wasn't originally able to travel with him in cars, but God, Midoriya knew things had changed and were changing, and what did he even know anymore? Gami remained in the back seat as they started driving, but Midoriya still didn't dare let go of his hand. He let his mind hone in on the soft conversation the two adults were having in the front seat, rather than drifting back to the worries that never seemed to leave him. Part of him wanted to speak. He didn't know what he would say, but part of him wanted to hear the sounds of words again, rather than just feeling his lips mimicking the movements. And after screaming his heart out before, he didn't think any more discomfort from his throat pulling against the bruising would really bother him enough to stop. But he didn't really want to talk if Gami wasn't going to talk back to him. Maybe that was selfish. Maybe he was taking Aizawa and Uraraka and Tsukauchi and everyone who cared about him's kindness for granted. He knew he shouldn't be. He'd known what his life would be like without him. He'd lived it. He would always be incomprehensibly grateful for having them in his life, but without Gami, he couldn't help but feel completely and utterly alone. If Gami wasn't going to stay, after everything they'd been through, who was to say anyone would? No, he couldn't think like that. He leaned his head against the window, using the rumble of the car to forcefully drive those thoughts away. They arrived at the station, and Gami was still unresponsive. Midoriya tried to put on a brave face, but both of his hands were clutching Gami's at this point. Aizawa sent him a glance, once for the clearly unnatural movement of his hands and another for leaving his neck exposed. Midoriya got the message, but found it painful to even tear one of his hands away from the ghost's. He left his neck exposed. Suddenly that didn't feel like the biggest issue anymore. Touching it was still a big issue, though, which made treating his injury at the station much more of a hassle than anyone wanted. But after a couple of attempts, and constant self-reassurance that no one at the police station was going to try and choke him out again, he was able to receive some basic aid, and Midoriya would have been lying if he had said that he didn't immediately feel some relief. Tsukauchi led them to a smaller conference room, leagues less intimidating than the interrogation rooms they'd passed on the way here. There was a large spot cut out of the wall next to the door, and Midoriya recognized the shine of one-way glass. His gaze must have lingered, because the detective sent him a gentle smile. "Don't worry, it'll just be Aizawa behind there." Said hero held up his hand. "I'll knock if anyone else decides to drop by." It easily could have been a lie. A straight lie spat into his face, and he wouldn't have known any better. Part of Midoriya wanted to think that way, to narrow his eyes disbelievingly and hold on to the paranoia that had gotten him so jadedly far. But a bigger part of him was tired of that life. A bigger part of him was weary and worn from the constant guarding, tired of thinking the people that he loved would hurt him. He wanted to trust Aizawa, so he did. He looked up at the hero, gesturing his hand slightly. Can I leave him here with you?" He wasn't worried about Tsukauchi standing right next to them. The detective already knew about the ghost's existence, courtesy of Nezu all those months ago. But he wasn't sure if there were cameras in the hallway, and despite how concerned he was about Gami, he had enough foresight to be somewhat cryptic. Aizawa thankfully got the message, and if Tsukauchi picked up on the strange choice in wording, he didn't comment. "Yeah, that's fine. I'll do my best, and I won't leave." Midoriya looked down at his hand, curled around Gami's, but seeing the ghost's skeletal hand only made him want to grip it tighter. But he trusted Aizawa, so with a heavy heart, he pulled his fingers away. He grabbed Aizawa's hand on instinct, and before he could think about what he was doing, he placed Gami's hand in Aizawa's, wrapping Aizawa's fingers around it. He held it there for just a moment, trying to convince himself that this was the equivalent, before finally letting go. Watching Gami's hand pass right through and fall limp at his side. Aizawa, without a word, curled his hand tight, giving Midoriya a reassuring nod. The boy held back his tears, desperately wishing Aizawa could see Gami too. "Thank you." And with that, Midoriya allowed himself to let go, walking into the conference room alone with Tsukauchi. The detective gestured for Midoriya to sit in an empty chair, taking the one across from him as he set his paperwork down onto the table before them. "Before we start, I do want to say on behalf of the police force, we really appreciate your cooperation. I can't imagine any of this has been easy for you." "Well," Midoriya looked off to the side, gathering his scrambled thoughts. "We both want him caught. Anything I can do to help." Tsukauchi nodded. "To catch you up to speed, in response to the USJ and Hosu incidents, we've established a special task force composed of heroes and officers dedicated to apprehending the League of Villains. Since you spent so much time with their leader, Shigaraki Tomura, we're hoping you can provide us with some more insight than we had before." The detective then picked up a metal object, a voice recorder, from the table, showing it to Midoriya. "For the sake of documentation, our conversation will be audio recorded. There will be no video recording, though, just so you're aware." Midoriya nodded, instinctually licking his lips, hoping his voice had recovered enough to come out clear for the recording. "Okay. Where do you want me to start?" Tsukauchi took that as a sign to continue, and clicked the voice recorder on. They started off simple, thankfully enough. Tsukauchi's questions were general, asking about Shigaraki's mannerisms, his appearance, things to help round out his profile. Midoriya didn't have much trouble answering those. The essence of Shigaraki had practically been burned into his memory. He had to catch himself a couple of times, however, when the trauma of his nightmares started to overtake objective facts. He looked off to the side, and he would try to gather himself once more. He wouldn't dare close his eyes, lest he truly manifest the sight of a corpse's chapped smile and the feeling of rough fingertips peeling his flesh into reality. Tsukauchi didn't seem to mind his pauses as he scribbled away his thoughts onto the notepad in front of him. Midoriya took a shaky breath, deciding to bite the bullet before the detective would ask him to do so. We ended up talking about the hero killer. Shigaraki couldn't understand why everyone was so obsessed with the hero killer when he was also in Hosu that night. And what did you tell him? The question was innocent and uncharged, but Midoriya still flinched anyway. So, what do you think the difference between the two of us is? I told him the truth, he admitted solemnly. That people would always be more interested in what they morbidly understood than aimless acts of violence. I'm worried I was too honest, that in telling him he lacked ideals, I accidentally gave him some. That's not true. Tsukauchi softly shook his head, looking up from his notepad. You said what you had to in order to make it out alive. No one can blame you for that. The immoral part of Midoriya did. Tsukauchi continued unaware. Though that does help solidify my guess that the League isn't exactly unified. Shigaraki sounded like he was acting alone today. And from what you said about ideals, an organized group of villains would have a motive to their madness by now, especially after numerous public appearances. Well, they're still going after All Might. If anything, Shigaraki seemed renewed in that, Midoriya supplemented. I think he thinks that destroying All Might will force people to acknowledge that the world is dangerous, that it's not as safe as heroes like All Might fight for us to believe. Everyone will finally understand when I show them that there's no world where everyone is safe. No hero can promise them that. At least we can rely on that consistency. Tsukauchi rubbed his temple. Anyway, thanks for your help, Midoriya. Midoriya looked down at his lap, a harsh squint returning to his eyes. You've been such a great help, Midoriya. If only there was something I could do in return. I just wish I could have stopped him. The words came tumbling out of Midoriya's mouth before he even had the chance to catch himself. Ended it all right then and there. Saved everyone the trouble. Hey, Tsukauchi set his pencil down, a gentle concern in his eyes. You held it together while he was threatening you and other civilians. Most people would have gotten scared and started panicking. It was thanks to your cool head that nobody got hurt. Midoriya didn't exactly feel cool-headed, but the detective's reassurances brought a shaky smile to his face. Tsukauchi started stacking up his papers. Well, I think I've held you here long enough. Let's get you... Wait! Tsukauchi paused, noticing the furrowed look in Midoriya's brows. Slowly, he set his papers back down. Sorry, Midoriya stumbled over his voice. It's just that... something you said has been stuck in my mind. You keep calling Shigaraki the leader of the League of Villains? Yeah. Tsukauchi rubbed his nape sheepishly. We're aware that the League is some mysterious sensei figure that Shigaraki seemingly looks up to, in part thanks to your testimonies for the USJ and Hosu incidents. But we don't really have enough information on them to actively consider them in any of our counteractive strategies. Midoriya's gaze snapped up suddenly, his eyes reflecting the light bulb that seemingly lit up in his head. Shigaraki mentioned some things to me about Sensei. He shifted his eyes to the voice recorder, choosing his next words very carefully. That he wanted to take my quirk. or something like that." Tsukauchi's eyes glazed over coldly, alarm bells ringing in his head. Slowly, yet deliberately, he shut the voice recorder off. This action did not go unnoticed. "Midoriya." The detective's voice was firm, losing the lightheartedness that the interview had managed to maintain so far. "This is very serious. Is that exactly what Shigaraki said? It's just us and Aizawa now, no one else." He rubbed his hands together at the sudden shift in energy. His heart pounded nervously. "Well, he said that my powers intrigued Sensei, but that there wasn't a point if Sensei couldn't take them for himself. Somehow, Shigaraki found out from Sensei that my powers aren't quirk-related, and I don't know how." Tsukauchi looked off to the side, gears turning in his head. The answer seemingly did not make him feel any better. "Aizawa," he called out to the one-way glass. "Get in here." Not even a second later, the underground hero entered the room, a stern look on his face. The detective didn't give him a chance to speak. "I'm calling All Might here." Aizawa narrowed his eyes. "Suka, I know this is sudden, and probably a lot more than I could ask of either of you, but we need to fill All Might in on Midoriya's quirk situation. There are things All Might and I have been keeping secret too, and right now, everyone needs to be on the same page, especially now that Midoriya's gotten involved. The League isn't keeping things secret, so neither can we." "Midoriya, have you told anyone else about your powers? Anyone not already in the loop?" Aizawa asked. Confused and afraid, Midoriya shook his head honestly. "I talked to Todoroki about the curse stuff, but I haven't told anyone about any of this. I don't understand. What's going on?" "I don't know, but we're going to find out." The assurance was softer, before Aizawa's hard gaze turned back to Tsukauchi. "Do you think we have a leak? There are very few people who know about Midoriya's situation." Tsukauchi shrugged. "It's too soon to say. Let me get All Might over here so we can all get up to speed. It's not my secret to share." He looked over to Midoriya. "I'm sure you would understand." Midoriya, stressed and frazzled, heard the honesty in the detective's voice, and any resistance in his heart conceded. This was a long time coming. "I'll tell him." "Thank you, Midoriya. I really can't thank you enough." Tsukauchi sighed, trying to rub away his stress-induced wrinkles. "We might be here a bit longer than expected, if you two want to get something to eat real quick." "How does that sound, Midoriya?" Aizawa tried to make light of the growing mess of a situation, and while Midoriya was not exactly put at ease, he appreciated the gesture nonetheless. "I'm sure we could find some place nearby." Midoriya's stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since breakfast, and he looked up almost excitedly. "Yeah, Izuku, can we talk?" The boy snapped his head to the one-way glass, watching with a breath stuck in his throat as Gami floated lazily into the conference room. He stumbled over like he was drunk, nearly knocking his chair to the floor. Tsukauchi reached appropriately, confused and rather startled at the odd behavior, but Aizawa held him back. Midoriya first grabbed Gami's robe, squeezing the fabric between his fingers. Not as much fog and mist escaped his grip, but it wasn't as solid as he was used to. Worried, he dropped his hand down to take Gami's hand instead, rubbing his skin against the bone. It was rough and grating, and that soothed him slightly. "Gami, please keep talking. Please, I'm not going crazy." The ghost bowed his head shamefully. "I am sorry. I'm so very sorry." Midoriya hung his head in return, hiding the tears that started welling up in his eyes. I'm sorry, Aizawa-sensei." He fought desperately to keep his voice even and indifferent. Can we get the room to ourselves, please?" "Yeah, not a problem." He could not see his teacher's reaction, but the sincerity in his voice told him everything. "I'll pick you up something." Come on, Suka. We've got stuff to do. The detective hesitated, but decided to trust in his old friend. There's no recording in here, just so you know, and the station's pretty empty since everyone's over at Kiyoshi Ward right now. So you won't have to worry about anyone behind the glass. Thank you. It was wobbly and raw. You don't have to thank me. It's really the least I can do. Aizawa beckoned Tsukauchi, and together, they left the conference room. Midoriya waited for the door to click shut before completely falling apart. Don't do that again. Please, I can't do that again. Gami cradled him like he always did, wiping away his tears like he always did. I'm sorry. He made a great effort not to promise anything. They stayed wrapped in each other's arms, curled in an embrace like they'd never known separation, until Gami broke it for the both of them. I'm sorry, Izuku. I never meant to leave you alone for as long as I did. Gami brushed a hand into Midoriya's hair, trying to force the feeling to memory. Midoriya leaned in, wiping the redness from his eyes. There are things I need to tell you, things I should have told you a long time ago when I first recalled them. He stumbled over his words, swallowing the nerves that threatened to stop him in his tracks. But I was afraid. I was afraid to acknowledge what I saw, and to admit that it could be true. Midoriya clung to his mentor's robe. Gami, whatever it is, you're the most important person in my life. Nothing will change that. I'm never going to run away from you. Gami crumbled. You should. For the first time that Midoriya could recall, Gami let out an audible sob, wet with grief and shame. His shoulder sagged, and without Midoriya's support, he would have sunk right into the earth, never to be seen again. Gami, please. Please don't keep this all to yourself. Whatever it is, I'm here. I'll always be here. The ghost, still hunched over his successor, tried to open his mouth, but still found his words hesitating even after he pried his rusty maw open. Dust and lies settled on his tongue, bones trembling with the ache of centuries long ago. It would be so easy. Midoriya would never question otherwise. He would never have to know. He would never have to say. They could just move on, fight the battles happening now instead of ones from the past. But Gami knew he would just as easily lie to him too, and suddenly, the truth became inescapable. I remember who I was. The franticness in Midoriya's veins drained into soft sensitivity, and he caught the shame that accompanied the admission. You did. He was a man who went by many names, many of them lost to time. Gami slouched further in defeat, his hunch one of indignity rather than any intimidation. The ones that were not stained history instead. Midoriya stepped closer, grasping both of Gami's hands tightly in his own. The ghost clung to the sensation of second-hand life, drowning in guilt and grief, exploding with resentment and resignation, until none of it could be contained. Midoriya had never heard Gami sob until just a few moments ago. He was not prepared for raw weeping to follow. I don't think... He cut himself off with a laugh, broken and reverberant like a rusted church organ. No, I'm fairly certain I was not a good person. The boy shook his head. That can't be. Gami did not let him finish. I've still yet to remember things. Large chunks of time still escape me, but what I have remembered has been cruel and callous. Each memory that returns is more sickening than the last. He pushed himself away from Midoriya, suddenly feeling very ill. His hands, itchy with a light he did not deserve to touch, clawed their way into his hood, desperate to wipe away the presence from him. He felt sick, wretchedly ill, fighting the urge to purge himself from the world. I lived for 500 years. This is not one subsect of my time I can push away if it's negligible. I lived a horribly spiteful person. He hurt the same way he had been hurt, and found joy in the groveling of those who had once been him. Gami. Midoriya's voice resonated with heartache, with the same kind of denial Gami had once tried to hold on to. Maybe it wasn't as bad. He wished for me to think that way, too. He keeps pushing these pitiful memories into my head as if he was a wounded dog for 500 years. And I hate that I am truly torn. I hate that I feel remorse for him. Me. I don't know. His form shook with unease, crumbling away into fog and fragments. He tried to soothe his sobs by covering his mouth, muffling the sounds of despair he'd only recently learned how to express. But the sight of his own bony fingers nearly made him puke. I'm afraid to look down at my hands because I see them stained with blood and dust, and because I feel pity for the skin I wear. In all his moments of pitiful helplessness, Midoriya had never felt so helpless in his life. Watching Gami dig his palms into where his eyes would be, collapsing into a heap of nothing but anguish and abhorrence. The raw display of human emotion froze him to his core, and he wasn't sure if it was due to sympathy or shock. This is promising, though. If we can trigger your subconscious like that again, you might be able to remember more stuff. Midoriya wasn't sure where it had all gone wrong. Gami. The boy sank to the floor beside him. What's his name? Tell me his name. The ghost refused to look at him, hiding away in a cloud of fog that had once been his robe. He felt the signature warmth of Midoriya's hand at the edge of his spirit, and instinctively drew back into the undead chill he so desperately wished to be. Kimura. He is Kimura. Midoriya clasped both his hands tightly around his mentor's arms, holding firm, as he tried to pull away once again. He is Kimura, not you. You may be Kimura, but Kimura is not you. Gami suddenly lurched violently, and it took strength Midoriya was unaware he had to hold him in place. How can you just say that? How do you know? You don't know. You have no idea what we have done. Even I do not. He laughed wetly, ending his resistance against Midoriya's hold, to instead sink deeper into sadness. How pathetic is that? Even I do not know the extent of my sins. If I do not, then how could anyone else? Because I know you. The ghost looked up, and even without eyes, Midoriya could see his lost look. Unnaturally vulnerable and defenseless for all the years he'd stared into his void. Midoriya wondered if he had looked at Gami like that at some point long ago. Midoriya wondered how Gami had always managed to tell him the right things every time he did. I know you, and I don't need to know anything else to know that Gami is kind and thoughtful. Sometimes he stumbles over his words, and maybe he's a little sarcastic at times, but I know I can always trust him to say what's on his mind. He cares very deeply, even when I put him through all the trouble I cause. I know he always has my back. Once he sets his mind to something, I know he'll never give up, and I know I can rely on him no matter what. I don't know anyone else like him, and it's a miracle I know him at all. Midoriya released his grip on Kami's arm slowly, in case he tried to run away from him again. He wasn't offended. He wasn't infallible either. Fear consumed him more often than he'd ever admit, and he'd hated when people mistook his paralysis for bravery. But layered under all that fear, Midoriya had managed to find bravery throughout his life. And if someone like him could, then surely the person who'd inspired him could too. That's the Gami I know. He cupped the ghost's face in his hands. That was never a lie. That's the Gami you are. Between the soft drumming of his pulse at his fingertips, Midoriya felt a quiver at the edge of his touch, like the fuzziness of settling frostbite. Gami leaned in, slow and defeated, fog rolling off his outline. And Midoriya didn't even notice he was shaking until the ghost collapsed into his chest, grasping his shirt between his bony fingers like a lifeline. His sounds were muffled by his shirt, but Midoriya recognized them anyway. He opened his mouth instinctively to reassure him further, but all the times he had cried into Gami's chest flashed through his head, and he closed it instead, letting him mourn and heal in silence. They sat tangled together on the floor for what had to be an eternity before Gami's jaw creaked open. I am Gami. Midoriya nodded. That's right. He's Kimura, and you're Gami. Even so, I am afraid we will still have problems. Midoriya pulled away. We'll figure them out. We always do. Gami used the newfound distance to look away, unable to meet his successor in the eye. It may not be that simple. Tell me. The demand was firmly tender. I can't help if you don't tell me. He sighed, swallowing his fears deep where Kimura couldn't reach them. Kimura is still present in my head. Midoriya's eyes widened. What? Like, he can hear us right now? I don't believe so. Gami shook his head. I think, because I was allowed to exist without recollection of who I was, the memories that return to me are being split and allowing Kimura to grow as a separate presence within my mind. I do not believe he is able to actively listen, but just as I share his memories, he may share mine. That doesn't change anything. He's not you. I am afraid, Izuku. The admission struck something terrifying in Midoriya's heart. These memories, he drags me through them, even though I no longer wish to know anymore. And with every one that returns, I feel his presence growing stronger. I could not return to you earlier because he now has the strength to keep me trapped within my own mind, and I fear that regaining all of his memories will wipe my presence out entirely. When Midoriya didn't respond, Gami felt his heart sink. I did not wish to upset you. It was one of the many reasons I hesitated to tell you of what was occurring. His mannerisms and emotions have already started becoming ingrained in my actions. I wish not to say, but I don't know how much more time. Stop that. Gami sputtered, unprepared for Midoriya's newfound glare to pierce through his soul. Stop talking like that. Stop talking like you're going to give up on yourself. I just said before that you never give up once you set your mind to something. I don't want you setting your mind to giving up. Midoriya brushed away the water at the corner of his eyes, standing up so he could really tower over the ghost. You're worth fighting for, Gami. We're worth fighting for. I'm not going to stop until we figure this out, and neither are you. You're my partner. I need you to be all right so we can figure out how to pass this. Gami chuckled softly to himself, quiet with melancholy, yet light with hope. I don't know what I was thinking. Thank you for reminding me. Midoriya's harsh stare returned to a shaky smile. Good. They relaxed in the wave of silence that fell over them, the change of emotions finally allowed to dissipate from the space. Gami had always been one to appreciate silence for what it was, the peace of absence. But he knew the longer he chose to bask in it, the more nerve he would lose. And someone like Midoriya didn't deserve a mentor who lost his nerve. There was something else I meant to tell you, before I got distracted. Midoriya reached out for his hand, rubbing softly over the tops of his bony knuckles. If what Kimura says is to be believed, then the premonition ability we've been associating with death is actually completely unrelated. Gami started slowly. In the latest memory that returned to me, Kimura was granted an ability called All-Sight from beings much greater than ourselves. He referred to your visions under that title during our conversation afterwards. All sight, Midoriya repeated dumbfoundedly. Did he say anything else about it? Gami nodded. He said that all sight belonged to our soul, not to you. I don't think it was meant to be passed down to you, but he did not seem surprised that you were able to use it as well. There is much he still withholds from me. The ghost touched at his wispy chest. But because it belongs to our soul, its effectiveness may be tied to my own will. There is a strong likelihood that the reason you experienced such abnormalities with premonitions leading up to today was due to the fear and denial I was experiencing prior. Midoriya touched his arm gently. This isn't your fault. You didn't know. And it's not like you did it on purpose, and maybe this is a good thing? Gami looked at him strangely. Midoriya quickly backpedaled with a nervous shake of his hands. I mean, these powers aren't a quirk. We know that. And while it has its advantages, the rest of the class, everyone around me, they're just going to get stronger. Quirks can grow. This really can't. He looked down at his gloved hands with pouty lips, deep in thought. But if what you said is true, if all sight really is that malleable, then maybe I have a little room to grow too. And despite the day, or how it had started, Gami couldn't help but crack a hidden smile and ruffle Midoriya's hair affectionately. I suppose. The silence returned. Gami wasted even less time finding a reason to break it again. I am sorry I lied to you all this time, even if by omission. To have betrayed your trust, it makes me feel foul. I wish to never do it again. You don't have to keep beating yourself up, Gami, Midoriya explained. I didn't realize how sensitive this whole thing was. Sure, I wished you'd come to me sooner, but I'm just glad you did now. I don't want you to have to go through this by yourself. The ghost looked thoughtful. Then, may I admit one other thing? He didn't wait for a response. I am very afraid of the ones who oversee us. Immediately after the words left his withered throat, his old bones shivered with chills. He glanced around nervously, expecting to find someone within his line of sight, but no one had come to join him or Midoriya. He tried to shake it off as passing paranoia. Maybe Aizawa or Tsukauchi had returned and were waiting on the other side of the one-way glass. How else could he explain the eerie sensation of eyes crawling over his form the moment those ironic words left his mouth? But despite all his efforts, even now, Gami didn't dare check the other side of the glass. You mean... Midoriya trailed off, catching himself before he made the same mistake again. Gami nodded in confirmation anyway. Kimura and his memories radiate an intense amount of fear towards them, a feeling that has even begun to stir in me just at their very thought. If it were anything else from him, I would hesitate much more before I credit it with any authenticity, but something about this, about them, truly gives me pause. The ghost looked away, but Midoriya still caught his shame. I feel delusional, but even now I cannot shake the fear that our conversations may not be as private as we believe. Gami turned back to him almost sternly. And it is that same fear that stops me here before I may possibly give us a reason to be smited, however irrational I may sound. Midoriya reached out his hand, wrapping his warm fingers around his cold ones. I trust you. It was just 3 simple words, but they still managed to rock Gami to his core. He didn't know how 3 simple words like those could manage to terrify and reassure him simultaneously. He squeezed his successor's hand a little tighter, wondering if the warmth that ebbed through him was what living had felt like for Kimura. You don't have to. Even now, there are still things I have yet to tell you. That's okay, Midoriya whispered softly. You can tell me when you're ready to. I trust you. Something in Gami's chest stuttered. He wondered if it was anything similar to a heartbeat. "Thank you." The silence found its way back once more, and this time, both of them were ready for it to stay. Midoriya nested his way back into Gami's arms, allowing his tears to drip quietly from his eyes. If Gami noticed the growing wet stain on his robe, or the fact that his boy didn't seem to look distressed, he didn't comment. They simply allowed the silence to blanket them, shielding them from everything in the world but each other. Midoriya tried to pull away to wipe at his eyes, but to his surprise, Gami didn't let go of his hand. "I'm not leaving you again. I promise." Midoriya laughed, using his other hand to clean up his face instead. "I'm not going anywhere either." It wasn't much longer until Aizawa and Tsukauchi returned to the station, a fresh bag of takeout returning with them. They moved to a quieter conference room with no cameras or one-way glass. Midoriya hadn't realized how hungry he was until Aizawa ripped the staples holding the bag closed and allowed the smell to waft through the air around them. Midoriya had forgotten that he hadn't eaten since breakfast, his plan for food court lunch interrupted by the day's turn of events. Aizawa had not, however, and Midoriya was grateful for the extra plate of gyoza the hero had picked up for him. He let the leftover steam rush to his face and pretended that whatever heat hadn't managed to dissipate during the car ride was the reason for his watery eyes and flushed cheeks. He had nearly finished his plate when a soft knock at the door broke the three of them out of their small conversation. Tsukauchi stood up and opened the door, revealing All Might in his civilian form hunched in the doorway. The #1 hero looked around the room, cracking a smile as he noticed the takeout containers strewn around the table. "Starting the party without me?" Midoriya swallowed his last gyoza just as Tsukauchi sighed. "Wish we could say it was a party, Toshinori, but I'm afraid it's been a long day." All Might nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "So I've heard." He turned his face to Midoriya. "Glad to see you're doing all right after what happened earlier, young Midoriya." Midoriya nodded like he had been. "Me too." Tsukauchi coughed, drawing all eyes back to him as he returned to his seat. "Well, in an effort to not keep us here any longer than we have been, I say we get started." The air in the room turned serious as All Might took a seat next to the detective. "It seems the League isn't going to bother keeping secrets, so we shouldn't either. The more information we collect and share, the better equipped we'll be in case something like this happens again," Tsukauchi reiterated. "We can't afford to keep each other in the dark anymore." "You made that clear over the phone, Tsuka," All Might sighed, resting his arms on the table. "But I agree. I guess I should start then." He turned to Aizawa and Midoriya, on the other side of the table. "Young Midoriya, I know we've only spoken a few times before," All Might started. "But do you remember when we spoke after what happened at the USJ, when I mentioned a great enemy of mine? I'll be honest, I was worried you'd received a quirk from a great enemy of mine." The boy's eyes widened, and he nodded his head. Aizawa, next to him, leaned forward in subtle interest. "There is much I've yet to tell you about my quirk, young Midoriya. Even more so to you, Aizawa. I recognize this. But please, allow me to say what I must." No one moved to interrupt, giving All Might a sign to continue. "My quirk, One for All, was derived from another odd quirk, a power so old it faded to whispers and rumor. The name of that quirk is All for One." Midoriya's heart hammered in his chest, a sudden, sinking feeling washing over him. His breath trickled out from his lips, his lungs shuddering under the gravity that slowly crushed the room. No one really noticed the way Aizawa leaned just a bit more forward in his seat. No one really noticed the way Gami stuttered mid-motion, looking hard at All Might, before his vision fuzzed out of focus. That quirk allowed its user to steal other quirks, and the user could either keep the quirks for himself or give them to someone else. "What?" The gasp slipped from his mouth before he had the chance to catch his breath. "You mean something like that existed. All Might nodded solemnly. Back when quirks were just starting to become prominent, before society had figured out how to handle the newly powered among them, there was a person who had managed to harness the chaos for his own gain. He went by the name of his quirk, All for One. The room was silent, save for the soft ruffling of Gami clutching at his chest, trying to stop the strange thumping echo rattling his bones. He stole quirks from others, and then used his overwhelming abilities to spread his influence across the country. He manipulated people to serve him, and committed countless heinous acts with little resistance. In the blink of an eye, he became the leader of villains and ruled over Japan. I've heard plenty of online speculation about a forgotten villain from Japan's past. But isn't that just stories and rumors? Midoriya asked shakily, overwhelmed by what he was hearing. You know, things that parents tell their kids to get them to be good. Legends like Shitakiri Suzume and the Sandaman. All legends are based in some truth, All Might mumbled. And sometimes those truths are a rather shameful history people would rather ignore. Even I do not even know the extent of my sins. Midoriya frowned, but quietly resigned. All for One amassed his army of followers by tricking people into trusting him, or forcing them to submit to his will, though even his gifts did not come without consequence, the hero admitted. There were many poor souls who couldn't bear the sudden burden of the quirks they were given. They became like mindless puppets, incapable of speaking or cognitive thought, just like the Nomu are. Midoriya lurched back in his chair in shock, just as Aizawa shot forward. What are you saying? Aizawa leaned on the table, a hard look in his eyes. That this villain is somehow still alive and responsible for the Nomu's creation just as he was centuries ago. But All Might shook his head. One who steals quirks has no limits. Anything's possible. The USJ incident with the first Nomu was what got the special task force started. Tsukauchi jumped in. Toshinori and I suspected that All for One may be back, and Midoriya's statement from the mall today only confirms it. All Might closed his eyes briefly in thought. There are quirks that can halt aging. I'm sure he made it a top priority to get his hands on one of those, since the moment he first rose to power. The room fell silent again under the crushing truth that no one wanted to admit. I've already told this part to young Midoriya, but All Might turn to face Aizawa. One for All has the ability to be passed down to other users, growing stronger with each new user who wields it. I thought I had managed to defeat All for One many years ago, completing One for All's mission. But it seems that wasn't the case. All Might then looked down at the floor, eyes overcast with shame. And with the way my power grows weaker each day, it may end up in the hands of my new successor, and the rest of the new generation of heroes to finally put an end to All for One. To clean up the mess I could not. Midoriya picked at his nails from underneath his gloves, the prickling feeling of frustration trapped just beneath his eyes. This was who was behind the League of Villains. And if All Might couldn't beat him, what chance did anyone else have? Sensei seems to know so much about you. I'm almost a bit jealous. What chance did he have? Aizawa cleared his throat, startling Midoriya out of his head. I presume, even if I asked you who your successor was, who you've chosen to pass both your quirk and your burdens down to, you wouldn't say, would you? All Might paled suddenly. Well, You have to understand that the less people who know the identity of my successor, the more time they'll have to strengthen One for All before they're eventually outed. Isn't that the same logic that got us here in the first place? Aizawa narrowed his eyes. We're behind the 8 ball. The enemy knows more about us than we do each other, all because we're keeping secrets from one another. Midoriya, caught off guard by Aizawa's sudden aggressiveness, could only snap his head back and forth between the two like a tennis match. I don't know who his successor is either, if that's any consolation, Shota, Tsukauchi admitted. But I don't think that information is the most relevant right now. We're not talking about his successor, and neither is the League. They're focused on Midoriya right now. And Sensei would love to finally meet you. Just. Aizawa rested a hand on his forehead, his voice small and exasperated. He turned to look at All Might. Just tell me it's not Midoriya. Tell me that's not the reason you've already told him half the stuff you're telling me right now. He can't afford to have two different targets on his back. For as much as Aizawa attempted to hide it, no one was prepared for the raw amount of emotion that leaked from his voice. He always looked tired, sure, but the exhaustion dripping from his bones now didn't seem the same. Midoriya had to glance back, just to make sure this wasn't Gami who'd accidentally floated into frame instead. It's not me, Midoriya confirmed before All Might could even respond. Why All Might's told me so much about his quirk, I don't really understand. But even if he offered me his quirk, I wouldn't take it. But if I were to offer you my quirk once more, the power of One for All, would you accept it? He decided not to mention the first instance. Aizawa looked at Midoriya and gave him a small, resigned nod, but only he could see a flash of relief that sparkled in the hero's eyes. The atmosphere faded into silence, and Midoriya glanced around for a few moments before he realized that All Might wasn't going to continue anymore. His heart pounded in his chest, so loud he was sure the whole room could hear it. He looked down in confusion. His hands were trembling. When did that start? Midoriya, Tsukauchi called out to him. When you're ready. Yeah, sorry. He cursed his stutter. Why was he stuttering? This wasn't a big deal. He knew this would happen eventually. All Might wasn't even someone he distrusted anymore. His head knew that. Why couldn't he get his body to understand? There was nothing to be afraid of. There was no threat. Why was his body finding one anyway? Gami placed a cold hand on the small of his back, and instantly his heart slowed as the chill weighed it back down. I guess I should start from the beginning. He licked his lips, feeling them crack against his tongue. My quirk isn't a quirk. At All Might's confused look, Midoriya bit into his cheek, bringing his hands up onto the table. What I can do, my abilities, none of it is related to having a quirk factor. Midoriya slid off one of his gloves, pressing it down lightly against the table and exposing the skin of his palm. I don't have a quirk factor, and yet... He reached for a napkin left over from the takeout earlier, picking it up with his gloved hand. Aizawa understood what he was going for, and with a quick blink, his eyes turned red, and his hair floated from his scalp. Midoriya made clear effort to lock eyes with the underground hero before switching the napkin over to his uncovered hand. Instantly, it shriveled into dust. All Might leaned over the edge of the table in disbelief as Aizawa deactivated his quirk, and Midoriya slipped his glove back on. Fascinating. And you're sure it's not an unusual mutant quirk? I understand Aizawa's quirk doesn't work on those. Aizawa shrugged. That would be the most logical explanation. But we haven't had an opportunity to officially debunk any alternate possibilities other than what Midoriya told to us. The number one hero frowned. I'm not sure I understand. How are you all so sure it's not at all quirk-related, then? Tsukauchi jumped in at the skepticism. Nezu had me confirm everything with my own quirk. All of what Midoriya told us, what he's saying currently, it all registers as true. Midoriya looked between the three adults, unsure of how to continue. He barely understood the details behind his own powers, and while he was lucky that the people he'd shared the secret with had chosen to believe him, he was just that, lucky. He couldn't really offer any explanation beyond what little Gami had told him, the little that Gami actually knew. I know it sounds a little unbelievable, Midoriya interrupted the squabbling around him. The rest of what I have to tell you is likely more so, but could you please hear me out? All Might softened. Of course, young Midoriya. I didn't mean to sound like I was challenging you. The whole purpose of this meeting was to finally fill each other in. Aizawa and Tsukauchi backed down at the ceasefire, allowing Midoriya to continue as he was before. Do you remember the first time we met? He asked quietly, still trying to find his voice. Under the overpass. Of course, my boy. All Might's shoulders dropped guiltily. I don't think I could forget. I wasn't lying then. I really didn't have a quirk. What I have now, it was passed down to me. Midoriya chuckled at the irony. Kind of like One for All, actually. He knew he was stalling. He was sure Aizawa and Tsukauchi knew too. And while part of him was grateful for them letting him take the conversation at his own pace, part of him wished they'd just force him to get to the point already. He glanced behind him briefly. Gami stood tall and imposing, filling his meek shadow into something almost tangible. Midoriya could touch him, reach his hand out and take his skeletal fingers in his own. Now was one of the many times he wished he wasn't the only one who could. God, this is going to sound crazy. Midoriya shook his head, pressing his eyes shut for a moment. There was a person before me who had my abilities, but when he died, those powers got passed down to me by complete chance. The reason I know what I have isn't a quirk is because he existed long before quirks even started showing up in people. What do you mean? All Might furrowed his brows. By that logic, such a person would be even older than All for One. Apologies in advance. Gami drifted out from behind Midoriya, floating to the empty chair next to him, across from All Might. But I cannot allow you all to dance around this topic anymore on my behalf. And with that, Gami grabbed down hard on the back of the chair and pulled it towards him with a deafening screech. Everyone in the room jumped, even Midoriya. All Might shot out of his own chair like a startled cat, blonde hair bristling in surprise. Tsukauchi lurched, a hand over his chest to try and calm his racing heart. Even Aizawa was caught off guard by momentary shock, but the underground hero recovered quickly and turned to the chair. Well, I see you've decided to join us, Aizawa commented lazily. That I have, Gami replied, as he sat down and pushed himself towards the table with another harsh scrape. The number one hero stood up from his chair, eyes darting between all parties. What is going on? Midoriya swallowed thickly, pressing his lips together into a fine line. Well, All Might. Midoriya gestured to the empty chair. Meet Gami. Midoriya had forgotten how bizarre his whole situation really was. Sitting down in front of All Might, hearing the words coming out of his own mouth, he wondered how anyone had ever believed him in the first place. He could barely believe himself, even with the ancient specter sitting beside him. Embarrassingly, he found himself drifting into silence sometimes, afraid that his latest claim would be the thing to shatter the trust he'd slowly been building with the number one hero. He half expected Aizawa or Tsukauchi to take over at some point, like they somehow knew more about his situation than he did. Still, through every unbelievable claim came gentle reassurances from the other two adults, easing All Might past the notions of death and immortality and the dead themselves, until Midoriya finally reached the tentative end. I see, was the first thing All Might muttered after Midoriya finally trailed off for good. The hero looked hesitantly over to the side, resting his exasperated eyes on the empty seat. So there really is a ghost here with us. Midoriya gave a nervous smile, lulling his head unconsciously toward Gami. Yeah, he's been with me as long as I can remember. I don't know what I would have done without him. You'd have persisted, even without me. But I am glad to have been there then, as I am now." Gami ruffled his successor's hair affectionately. Midoriya leaned into the touch with a snort. "He says I would have been fine without him," he relayed for the rest of the room. "But Gami's notorious for underselling himself." All Might nodded, but his eyes stayed fixated on the way Midoriya's hair bounced and flattened, as if there really was a hand threaded through it. He watched in quiet observation as the boy jabbed an elbow playfully into what was seemingly only air, and was pushed back in retaliation by seemingly nothing at all. All Might looked around, his ears filled with the gentle laughter bubbling from Midoriya, and couldn't help but catch the soft look in Aizawa's eyes, and the mellow smile on Tsukauchi's face. He sat and soaked it all in, wondering if this domestic bliss had truly been there the whole time, or if he'd managed to miss it from the very beginning. "So, ghosts are truly commonplace." Midoriya blinked owlishly, ending his play fight as he suddenly remembered he and Gami weren't exactly alone. I guess so. It's not really in the way you're probably thinking of, but every person does have a soul." All Might hummed in thought as the room quieted back down to seriousness. "I'm just curious." He looked up with a surprising amount of vulnerability in his eyes. "There wouldn't happen to be a ghost with me, would there? I'm just wondering." His words got lighter towards the end, but Midoriya could still hear the longing that hid underneath. And despite already knowing the answer, Midoriya was still bewildered enough by the request to scope out the room anyway. "I'm sorry." Midoriya shook his head, his heart heavy with a guilt he couldn't place. "Souls don't really persist after passing. It would be unusual to see. Actually, I've never seen a ghost other than Gami, much less a cognitive one." He glanced at his mentor in confusion. "Do you know anything about that?" Gami couldn't even open his jaw before a piercing throb split open his skull. "You have been involved ever since you refused to pass on." He flinched at the echoes of his voice, something in his chest hammering with fear until his mind was able to process that the words were nothing more than an unwanted memory. "A conversation for another time." Midoriya frowned, but despite how he turned his head, Gami did not meet his eyes. He turned back to the table. "Sorry, we got a little sidetracked." The admission jolted the rest of the adults back on track, with Tsukauchi taking the lead. "As of now, there are only a small handful of individuals who have any knowledge about Midoriya's abnormal abilities. Myself, Aizawa, Yamada, Nezu, Recovery Girl, and now you. I'm sure you can understand why it's such a substantial issue that Shigaraki and hypothetically All for One somehow know about this. What's more concerning to me is how they know that Midoriya's powers aren't quirk-related," Aizawa tacked on. "That information we've kept very secret." "What are you implying?" All Might jumped in. "That one of you is a leak." The detective ran a hand through his hair. "That would be the most logical assumption, and yet I just don't believe that's the case." "I get where you're coming from. I wouldn't want to believe it either." All Might sighed, sagging his shoulders. "But what other option is there? How else could All for One know?" They drifted into silence before Aizawa, who'd been quietly in thought himself, turned to the boy next to him. "Midoriya, is there any possibility that All for One may have known Gami when he was alive?" Midoriya's heart skipped a beat. "I lived for 500 years. It would be a stretch, even if they existed in the same time period. Japan is still a large country. I don't like relying on coincidences," Aizawa admitted with furrowed brows. "But it could be that All for One has known about this far longer than we have." "That would actually make some sense," All Might agreed. "All for One and One for All are the longest living quirks to date. If anyone would have knowledge on something like this, it would either be one of my predecessors or All for One himself." "Sensei seems to know so much about you." Midoriya swallowed thickly, running a hand down the back of his neck. "I mean, Gami's memory about his past has always been incomplete. He's only started remembering things a few months ago. He looked up at his mentor, who was strangely still. But do you know anything, Gami? The ghost in question did not respond right away. You will know the truth whether you wish to or not. I don't remember, he truthfully admitted. But every time that name is mentioned, I do feel strange. Gami gripped at his chest harshly, feeling a presence retreat back into the depths of his soul. He grit his teeth in frustration, trying to force him back into the spotlight. He knows something. What did you do? Hey, don't push yourself. Midoriya stood up all of a sudden, reaching out to try and stabilize Gami's rapidly deteriorating form. Aizawa spurred into action. What's wrong? The ghost dropped his head into his hands, trying to ground himself on the feeling of Midoriya's fingers pressing into him. But ultimately, whatever the memory was slithered back to where he couldn't reach. Damn it, it's right there. Midoriya turned back to the table, worry etched into his wrinkles. Gami strained himself trying to remember, but all he's getting is a sense of déjà vu at the name. The boy looked back to his mentor, eyes settling on the way his chest heaved like he was really struggling to breathe. But I don't think we should rule out that theory yet. Midoriya helped Gami back into his seat as Aizawa's expression returned to one of calm nonchalance. Regardless, I still think it's likely UA has a leak somewhere, Tsukauchi stressed, leaning back in his chair. I mean, the League had intimate knowledge of the USJ layout, not even mentioning the fact that they knew All Might would be there. And while this incident seemed coincidental, I don't want to put too much faith in that. He glanced at the number 1 hero from his peripherals. If anything, I think it's proof that the League isn't just targeting All Might anymore. But I see you have something I want. How thoughtful of you. Midoriya's stomach churned as he desperately tried to keep his takeout down. Aizawa huffed in grudging agreement. Unfortunately, I think there's a decent chance that students as a whole will be targeted from now on. Of course, Tsukauchi nodded. The police will remain on high alert, but UA also has to be vigilant. All Might shared a glance with Aizawa, all while Midoriya looked nervously between them. Finally, All Might sighed, wiping the sweat from the side of his temple. I think we need to seriously consider moving the location of the summer camp. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 51 of Deku in Death. Chapter 52 will be up next. Again, drop those thoughts, reactions, comments about this fic so far. Also, sliding over to AO3 to leave those comments, kudos, and support to the original author. I'm eager to hear what you all thought about this chapter, though, and as always, thank you so much for listening.